When it comes to profiling your opponents, there are some very simple buckets, like this person's good or bad, and that's it. And there are very complicated and nuanced buckets, like this person's a tag who 3-bets 5% too much from the button and also likes non-dairy creamer in their coffee. And at the end of the day, you need a system that works well for you, that you understand very well, and today I'm going to give you exactly that, breaking poker players into 4 major buckets and a couple of subcategories underneath that, so that way you can very quickly figure out who they are, what they're like, how you can beat them, and which one you should be striving for as well. Let's get into it. Good morning, how we doing today? My name is James Sweeney, aka Split Suit, and today we're going to talk about the 4 types of poker players. Now these are 4 major buckets and categories that you can use. There are some subcategories underneath them, but we'll go through all of them step by step today so that way you can have a system that works well for you for being able to very quickly profile and figure out, hey, who's my opponent likely going to be and how do I typically make money from them? So without further ado, let's break this into 4 very simple types of poker players, and then we'll go into some details on each of them. So the 4 major categories are this: donks, fish, regs, and elites. That's it. Now at first glance you might hear these and think, well, couldn't I just simplify this into 2 different buckets, right? Bad players and good players? And maybe, but there's a lot of nuances between them even before we start looking at some of the subcategories. So let's kind of define all of them so we have a working definition. Alright, so let's start by breaking each of these down, starting with the donk category. So these are the weakest poker players in the pool. Donks have likely never studied any poker strategy and often believe that poker is a game of pure luck. Now, we're not using the term donk as an insult, as a lot of players tend to use it, and, well, even YouTube comments and everywhere in between on the internet, but this is a technical term that we're using to designate a specific caliber of opponent, and these are by far and away the most profitable poker player for us to play against. Alright, now moving on to the next category, which are fish. These are players that are slightly stronger than donks and may have considered some basic strategy. Terms like donk and fish are oftentimes used interchangeably by a lot of players on the internet, but in the context of this skill grouping system, we're using the term fish to designate something closer to a weak regular. Now, opponents in the fish category make significant errors in their play, both pre-flop and post-flop, and they are the second most profitable category of opponents to have at the table after donks. And the next category after these are the regulars, or regs for short, and these make up a fairly large percentage of each player pool. Regs study poker strategy and follow a set system to try and actually make money. Now, it's important to understand that even though regs are above the average skill level, most of them are still losing players. This is simply because only a small percentage of poker players are actually long-term winners, and if you're wondering how that's true, well, of course that's thanks to rake. Now, it is possible that some regs may turn a marginal win rate before or after rakeback, but they are usually not big crushers unless the environment is very soft. Now, although there are a number of ways to exploit regs, their skill level is high enough that they won't be our main source of profits. And then the final category are the elite regs, or elites, and these are the top few percent of the player pool who crush their respective games. Now, we don't want to get overly dogmatic as to what win rate is required, but essentially if they are big winners over really big sample sizes, rest assured this is probably them, but understand that this is relative to any profiling system, right? The stronger your game gets, the fewer opponents you're probably going to classify as an elite regular, and you're probably going to classify them closer to something like a just basic reg, because you're going to be able to identify weaknesses in their game more easily because, again, your skill level is relative to theirs. So again, these are the 4 major types of poker players you're going to run into at the table: donks, fish, regs, and elites. And really understanding the relative nature of regs and elite regs is going to be very helpful for you. Now, that all being said, I think it's helpful to go into a little bit more detail and talk about some of these subcategories so we can have a better, more well-rounded understanding of exactly who these player types are and how we can go about beating them more easily. So just like before, we'll start with the donk category and go from there. And there are essentially 3 different subcategories within donks, starting with the volatile donk. So I would consider this the default player profile within the donk category. And looking at the volatile donk, some of their characteristics include open limping, some or all of the time, broken stacks, meaning less than 100 big blinds without rebuying, especially if playing online where auto rebuy is available. They play more than 30% of hands, sometimes even more than 50. They're volatile, making seemingly random big bluffs and high variance plays. They bluff rivers often and also bet mid-strength hands on the river, known as merging, and they do it incorrectly quite often. And they use fishy lines and sizes. sizes, including pre-flop min 3-bets and flop donk bets and post-flop min bets and all that kind of fun stuff. Now, in theory, there's nothing wrong with, quote, donk bets, but they tend to overuse this play, and again, they're pretty volatile, pretty much a question mark a lot of the time in terms of exactly what the heck they're doing and why. So against this player, there are essentially two major things you should be looking to do. One is to make sure that you understand that their aggression can be quite wide, way wider than it should be in a lot of situations. You should be more comfortable bluff catching and giving action with a slightly wider range than you would against other players for sure. And then number two, when they're on more of the passive side of things, feel very comfortable value betting against them. Now the next subcategory of donks would be the passive donk. And if you think about the volatile donk as one that likes to take risks, the passive donk is much more risk averse. Now the characteristics of the passive donk include open limping, but usually with a tighter range, still using that broken stack, less volatile, more passive, rarely bluffing, at least not for tons of chips. They tend to play less than 30% of hands, PFR sometimes even below 10%. They have a tight pre-flop 3-betting range, and there's usually a significant gap between VPIP and PFR. So as a general rule, when these players get aggressive, we should assume that they typically have value hands and typically get out of the way when we're holding more marginal hands ourselves. When they're being passive, they can call down with second best hands, so definitely make sure to value bet against them. But again, if they're getting aggressive, typically you want to be very careful when you have not so great holdings. And just for the record, if you would find it helpful, I did put together a one-page download for you if you wanted to download all of this information with all of the types, all the subtypes that we're talking about in this video. I'll leave a link for that in the description box, or use the link right in front of you on the screen. Whichever way, get it. It's very helpful, and just keep it on your computer for future study. Alright, moving on to the final sub-profile in the donk category. These are the calling stations, and they share a lot of the same tendencies as the donk profile, with one key difference, that they struggle to fold anything ever. And the strategic adjustment against these players is extremely simple, and that is to value bet aggressively and really avoid bluffing, since they're not going to fold hardly ever post flop. So again, look to value bet them thin, and that's where a lot of your win rate is going to come from these players. They're very easy to identify as well, because you're going to see them make ridiculous call downs against other players too. So take a mental note and then exploit them accordingly. Alright, so let's move on from the donk types and move over to the fish types and some of these subcategories underneath these. So looking at fish broadly for a moment, I think it's useful to think about them as weak regulars. It's not uncommon for them to have been exposed to some training material. They may have studied a little bit, watched some videos, they might understand basic poker concepts, and they might even avoid things like open limping, right? Something that a donk is very likely to do. A fish probably isn't going to do that all that often. But despite some level of competence, fish still have serious strategic issues, and advanced players will find them very easy to both spot and exploit. So general fish characteristics include being a, again, weaker version of a reg. They rarely or never open limp. They oftentimes still have a broken stack, again, less than 100 big blinds when auto reload is an option on their site. They are generally passive overall. Attempt to steal is often less than 35%. 3-bets often less than 7%. VPIP PFR gap often larger than 10, and the VPIP usually between 20 and 35%. So again, thinking about fish as kind of a weak regular category, one of the biggest subcategories within here would actually be nits, and these players are overly tight, especially pre-flop, tend to have a VPIP of 18% or lower in 6 max games, even lower in full ring games, and they rarely bluff post-flop. Beating these players is extremely simple. Essentially, if they want to start creating a big pot, especially pre-flop, typically get out of the way unless you have a huge hand, and when it comes to post-flop, you should be looking to win a lot of small pots against them, because they tend to roll over, and again, unless they have some huge hand developing. So again, very easy to beat them, very weak overall, and definitely fits very nicely within the fish category. The next subcategory would be the tight passive, and these share many of the characteristics of the default fish profile with a couple of important key differences. Those include a VPIP of 20% or less, PFR often less than 10%, very low 3-bet and ATS frequencies, and passive post-flop play, rarely bluffing overall. Now, the default fish profile bluffs rivers with a somewhat similar frequency to the regs, but tight passives tend towards under-bluffing massively, and they represent the exact middle ground between fish and nits. And then the final subcategory would be the aggro fish, and this is essentially a reg with a tendency to be overly aggressive in questionable spots. They are not risk averse at all, and they absolutely love gambling. They're one of the toughest opponents in the fish skill category overall, and their characteristics include similar preflop stats to the lag profile. They overplay made hands postflop, they bluff way too frequently and in many situations, situations, and they are very risk tolerant. And it's important to understand that the only thing that really separates an aggro fish from the stronger lag profile is a lack of post-flop awareness. Again, they tend to just overbluff in kind of weird spots, so against them, really unlikely you should be doing a lot of overbluffing. You should actually tend to hero call down more often, since hero folding against these players is often a sizable mistake. So you're going to get a lot more sticky with marginal hands that you really wouldn't do so with against other player types. Alright, so now it's time to move on and get over to the sub-profiles of the regs, starting with the tag. So the characteristics of a tag, short for tight aggressive, are as follows. VPIP somewhere between 20 and 25%, PFR between 17 and 20%, 3-bet around 7 or 8%, slightly on the risk-averse side, and a tendency towards slightly under-bluffing overall. Tags have a systematic and structured tight aggressive approach to the game. They don't generally have catastrophic leaks, and although they're competent players, only a percentage of them are actually winning in the long term. It's common for tags to be break-even or small losers over a large sample size before promos. Now, I suspect that most players watching this video would classify themselves as a tag. If you do as well, can you comment tag on this video real quick? I'm curious to see if the ratio is as high as I think it is. Alright, moving on to the next subcategory. These are the aggro regs or lags. And a lag or loose aggressive is the risk tolerant cousin of the tag. Characteristics include a VPIP between 25 and 33%, PFR between 19 and 25%, 3-bet between 9 and 12%, slightly on the risk tolerant side, and a tendency towards slightly overbluffing. A good lag will usually have a higher win rate than a good tag, but more skill is required to play a good solid lag strategy. The next subcategory is a rock, and this is essentially a very tight tag, kind of a middle ground between the nit and the tag overall. VPIP's usually going to be somewhere around 18 to 20%, and they rarely bluff post-flop. Our strategy against them is actually going to be quite similar to our strategy against nits overall, especially when they start showing aggression on later streets and even pre-flop. And then the final sub-profile within the regs would be the GTO Reg, and this is essentially someone who's trying to mimic GTO strategies, although typically unsuccessfully in most cases. Characteristics include aggressive 3-betting, oftentimes around 10%, VPIP in the 20 to 25% region, again similar to the tag, little or no cold calling aside from the big blind. They often use simplified strategies such as c-betting or checking their entire range, and they make more frequent use of overbetting overall. GTO regs are typically the toughest of the reg profiles, but it can vary, since GTO is impossibly difficult to execute accurately, and many GTO regs honestly don't even have a super strong understanding of what they're actually trying to implement in the first place. And then moving on to the elite regs, there's really no subcategory here. This is essentially someone who's just extremely tough to play against, consistently wins against us, even if we're unsure why. It's an opponent generally stronger than us, and it might not always be possible to understand why they're winning against us in the first place, and again, they are proven winners over a big track record. Our goal, of course, is to get here as much as possible, but there's no real subcategory, since how would you subcategorize them in the first place if they're really that elite and that much better than you? Are you even going to be able to understand exactly what they're doing, how they're doing it, why they're doing it, all that kind of stuff? So again, that's the place we should be looking for. It is relative overall, but there's no subcategories here to work with. So hopefully this gives you a reliable system you can use, one you can understand fully, to be able to categorize your opponents very, very quickly, even possibly put them into a subcategory and understand who they are. But being able to categorize your opponent is just one piece of the puzzle. Knowing how to exploit them is the stuff we really, really care about. And knowing how to beat each of these player types is exactly what we cover in my new book, The Exploitative Edge. If you know that there's a lot of win rate potential beyond just GTO memorization and you want to get into hardcore exploitative play, this is the place to do it. Talk about how to beat each of these player types across a bunch of different situations and spots, with lots of different data that you can use and understand these player pools more deeply. The Exploitative Edge is available in ebook, Kindle, paperback, and even audiobook on Audible. If you're interested, click the link in the description box down below or visit redchippoker.com/edge, EDGE, and really find out how you can start using this to your advantage and figure out how you can maximize your exploitative strategy. And with that said, thank you so much for hanging out today. Hope you enjoyed. I'll see you back shortly with a new video. And in the meantime, good luck out there and happy grinding.